All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Cheshvan, Stephen Tarizin, for dedicating all of Shemar and Shoshos this month in loving memory of Steve's father, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 20th yahrzeit. Oh, sorry. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, in the schus of continued health and refuah shlema for Shulam Eschana Bas Susha. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shavan together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Chash Baruch Hu Shemirat Hashem Shara Besoros Tovos upon all of Am Yisrael for many, many years to come. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, a really beautiful daf. Today's daf is Samech 65. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Samech Dalid Amud Beis 64b. So if you remember again, the Mishnah says as follows: Ola Sa'of. So in yesterday's daf, we spent a significant time speaking about Chatas Sa'of, bird Chatas. We've already begun to enter into the world of bird offerings, which in certain ways obviously are similar to animal offerings, but in other ways are fundamentally and profoundly distinct and different. So with that, let us begin. Let's go through this journey together. Says the Mishnah, Olas Ha'of Ketzad Nasis. How is the Olas Ha'of performed? So let's begin. Allah Lekevesh, Upana Lesovev, Uvalo Kern Dram Mizrach. So we'll say, remember again, we're continuing our journey through the Beis HaMikdash. Hoping this helps. Continuing our journey through the Beis HaMikdash. So remember again, Allah B'Kavesh. So remember again, the Kohen is coming up the ramp. And as he comes up the ramp, remember again, I will say, what's our rule for any time you're in the Mizbeach? Anytime you turn, you always turn right. So therefore, again, he's going to come up, hang a right, which brings him then to the southeast corner. Remember, when he hangs that right, he is walking on a ledge called the Sovev, right? So essentially he's walking below, you can't see it because it's too far. Remember, like these little brown squares, those are the chronos, those are the horns, the extended, the protruding corners of the Beis HaMikdash, of the Mizbeach, sorry. He's walking along the Sovev, walking along this ledge, now in the southeast corner. Okay, so now, and I will say here now he's going to go ahead and come to the southeast corner. Now, I will say, what I want to point out is something very interesting, just to contrast this, and hopefully, Emirat Hashem, hopefully tomorrow we finish the parak, which means we also close out the sugi of the bird karbanos. I want to do hopefully a couple of Rambams, Emirat Hashem, together to kind of help frame this, because there's a little bit of interesting back and forth in the Mishnah. Because remember, in the previous Mishnah, if you noticed, there was a phrase in parentheses, right? When it was talking about Chatas Ha'of, so the Mishnah also had this same phrase, that you go up to the ramp, hang a right, come to the Sovev, and come to the southeast corner. Now, what's interesting is many erase that line. They take out that line, which would then indicate to us that one of the primary distinctions between the Chatas Ha'of and the Olas Ha'of was the actual location of the Malika. If you take out that line, what that indicates to us is that Chatas Ha'of was not shechted, right? The Malika did not take place on the ledge by the southeast corner. Rather, it took place on the ground, okay? So, which would then put it in contradistinction to the Olas Ha'of, which is happening on the ledge at the southeast corner. So just, again, you don't have to remember that. You're like, no problem, already forgot it, right? But again, but I'm just pointing it out because there are some interesting similarities and some other distinctions, but Emirat Hashem tomorrow, we'll go through the Rambam in a little bit greater depth with all of this. Okay, so in any event, coming up the ramp, hang a right, go to the southeast corner. So same thing, you do Malika, and we spoke about Malika. We spoke about Malika yesterday, how Malika takes place. Bimol arpa, from the back of the neck. Umavdil. Rabbi say, if you notice, another distinction. Just keep in mind the distinction is Mavdil. What does Mavdil mean? Now, according to Rashi, if you remember getting yesterday's daf, Mavdil means you cut both through the esophagus and the windpipe. By Olas Ha'of, by Chatas Ha'of, Rashi said, you only sever one of the simanim, either the esophagus or the windpipe, and obviously the head remains attached. Now, the Gemara is saying over here that when it comes to Olas Ha'of, the head is fully severed. Okay, Mavdil, Umitza as Damal Mizbeach. Now, again, remember, by both Karbanos, we already find that Halacha L'maisa. Sorry. Good. That Halacha L'maisa, that when it comes to both of these karbanos, so remember again, there's no Kabbalah. We don't receive the blood ultimately in a kli. Instead, the blood is shaken from the body of the bird onto the mizbeach itself. That's called mitzah. Umitzah as dama al kiar mizbeach. And ultimately, again, we sprinkle the blood on the wall of the mizbeach. Notal as harosh v'hekif beis melikaso lemizbeach. So listen to this. Then you take the head. You put the head back over what we call the beis melikaso. Beis melikaso means, remember again, now that you did melika, the head is detached from the body. Then we do something interesting, which is we bring the head back to the neck, and what happens? And bring it to the mizbeach. V'saf go b'melach. Then we covered it in salt. V'zarko al gabe ishim, and you throw it on the fires. Now remember again, which fires are we talking about? Fires on the mizbeach, right? Fires on the mizbeach. So ultimately, again, you're taking the salted head of the olah sa'of, throwing it on the mizbeach. Okay, balo l'guf. Now you come back and deal with the body of the bird. Now also remember again, this is an olah. So remember again, what happens with every olah? Every olah, fully consumed on the mizbeach. Okay, so as remember again, contradistinction to olah sa'of, chata sa'of, chata sa'of. The only part of the bird that went on the mizbeach was the blood. The rest of the bird was consumed or used by the kohanim. So now back to the olah sa'of. So what happens? So again, you come back to the body of the bird, and what do? You take out the mora and the notes. Remember again, mora, the crop, notza, its feathers, and ultimately, again, when you pull out these items, so apparently the kishkas of the birds come out along with this. And now you take this again, the crop, the feathers, and the kishkas, and you throw it out like the intestines. And you throw out beis hadeshen. So yesterday's daf, where's the beis hadeshen? You're going to both say right here. Right here, southeast corner again, southeast corner, right to the ramp, right 3 amos away from the ramp, 10 amos down from the start of the ramp. You go ahead and you burn it by the beis hadeshen. Shisa v'lo hivdil. So I'll say ultimately then you tear, what you do is you rip the bird in two, but you do not tear it into 2 distinct pieces. V'im hivdil kasher. But if you did tear it into 2 pieces, ultimately the bird is kosher. Sof go b'melach. You go ahead and you then cover it with salt, right? Immerse it in salt. V'zorik al gabe ishim. You throw it on the fire. So I just want to point out, if you notice again, so the olah sa'of essentially has 3 different avodas done for it. There's the mitzui, there's the sprinkling of the blood, right? The blood application. There is the throwing of the crop, the feathers, and the intestines onto the beis hadeshen, which is over here. And then there's the burning of the rest of the bird carcass, bird body, on the top of the mizbeach itself. Okay, so Gemara says, Lo hisras moravos notzav espinami aimi yotzimam. So we'll say now the Mishnah says, let's say you didn't do certain things. For example, let's say you didn't pull out the crop, the feathers, and the intestines, or you didn't go ahead and cover it in salt. What's talacha? Kol sheshina b'me'achar shemitzas tamak sheira. So here's what's interesting about say. So remember, going back to the good old days of animal karbanos. What is the ikar avoda of a karban? Ikar avoda? Zrika. And pretty much once you have zrika, you're good to go. The Mishnah says the same halacha applies to bird offerings as well. Once you have what we call the mitzvah, remember again, the mitzvah is the act of taking the bird body and smearing the blood, sprinkling the blood against the mizbeach. Once you have mitzvah, you're good to go. And even in the event that you omitted something else, halacha l'maisa, the rest of the avoda is still kosher. Mitzvah, right there, same idea. He says, hivdil b'chatas v'lo hivdil ba'olah pasal. Now what happens if you severed the head by a chatas but didn't do so by the olah? Then what's the halacha pasal? This goes back to yesterday's daf. Right? This was the Mishnah. Mitzvah as damarosh v'lo mitzvah damaguf psula. If you squeezed out the blood of the head, but didn't squeeze out the blood of the body, the carbon is pasul. But if you squeezed out the blood of the body, but didn't squeeze out the blood of the head, ultimately, again, the carbon is kosher. Good. Chata sa'of shavos. I say now, interestingly enough, a little bit of a throwback. We're getting back to some halachos of lishma, shalol lishma, pigul, and Shinui Mekomo, which is very exciting. Chata Sa'of Shemalka Shalol Lishma. If you have a Chata Sa'of, right? Chata Sa'of. Now remember again, we're going back to the previous Mishnah. So remember again, yesterday's daf was Chata Sa'of. Today is Ola Sa'of, but now the Mishnah combines elements of both. Chata Sa'of Shemalka Shalol Lishma. If you have a Chatas where Malika was done Shalol Lishma, right? Which again, I both say, this harkens back to the first Mishnah Mesachas Zevachim. What was the first Mishnah in the Masechta? So remember again, in general, if you do a carbon shalol lishma, what's the halacha? In a nutshell, what's the halacha? Carbon is good, but does not count towards the obligation of the owner. Zevachim 101, literally the first halacha we learned in this beautiful Masechta. There is an exception to that rule, two exceptions to the rule. What are the two exceptions? Chatos and Look at you guys, incredible. Chatos and Pesach, beautiful. Chatos and Pesach, those are the two exceptions to that rule. So remember again, this concept follows us through all of Zevachim. So similarly again, so remember, we're dealing over here now with Chata Sa'of. So Chata Sa'of, Shemelka Shalol Lishma. If you have a Chata Sa'of and Malika was done Shalol Lishma, or Mitzah Dama Shalol Lishma, or again, the blood application was done Shalol Lishma, or Lishma v'Shalol Lishma. We've seen this before, Lishma Shalol Lishma. You have the proper Kavana by part of it, erroneous Kavana by another part of it. Oh, Shalol Lishma u'Lishma. This is again, I will say, depending on the order in which you have the mindset. Shalol Lishma Lishma. What's the halacha? Pasal. Pasal, no matter what, if you have a Shalol Lishma intention, sometime during the Chata Sa'of, ultimately the carbon is invalid. That's the way it works by a Chatas. Ola Sa'of, now both and I remember again, now we're jumping back. That's by a Chatas. What about by Ola Sa'of? Kshira. If you have a Shalol Lishma intention by Ola Sa'of, the carbon is still kosher. However, so again, Abba said, this is Karbanos 101. If by a non-Chatas offering you have Kavana Shalol Lishma Kavana, the carbon itself is still effective, but does not count towards your obligation. Echad Chatas Sa'of ve'echad Ola Sa'of, whether it's a Chatas Sa'of or an Ola Sa'of, Shemalkan, where you did Malika, V'Shemitza Estaman, and you went ahead and you did Mitzvah, which is the squeezing out of the blood, Le'echol davar shedarko le'echol olahaktir davar shedarko olahaktir chutzlim komo pasal ve'im bokaris. So we'll say now, transition to a different topic. By both Chatas and Ola Sa'of, if you did some part of the avoda, and when doing it, you had in mind to go ahead and consume the carbon chutzlim komo outside of its permitted time, or to burn, outside of its permitted place, or to burn part of the carbon outside of its permitted place, what we call chutzlim komo. What's the halacha? Pasal ve'ein bo kares. Rabbi say that is general halachos of chutzlim komo that we've seen many times before. Chutz lizmano. What happens if during some part of Chata Sa'of or Ola Sa'of you have in mind to do some part of the avodah or to eat some part of the carbon outside of the permitted time? Then what is that called, Rabbi say? What is that called? Pigol. The chayav and alav kares. And ultimately, again, you're chayiv kares. Incredible. Obilvad sheyakriv hamatir kimitzvaso. I will say, now remember again, this is back to also to Pigel 101. A carbon only becomes Pigel if what? If the matir, remember again, I will say, it's been a little while since we've had this. The matir is the permitter. If the permitter, as long as the permitter itself, right, which is the avodah, which is the part of the sacrificial service that ultimately renders the carbon effective, as long as the matir itself was offered, then ultimately, again, the carbon can become pigel. If the matir was not offered, pigel status cannot set in. So the Gemara says, let's give examples of this. The Mishnah says, sorry, Keitzad, karav hamatir kimitzvah. So what's an example where the permitter was done in the right way? Malak b'shtika. So it says, let's say the Kohen did malika. Malika b'shtika means, let's say, he didn't have any specific kavanah. I remember, again, one of the things we've seen by karbanos is that, sounds strange, but, and don't apply this anywhere else in life, but no kavana is good kavana, right? Remember again, Chazal were metaking that you don't have to have explicit intent for karbanos. Rather, again, it's more like negative intent ultimately undermines kavana. So for example, malak b'shtika, let's say he did malika, literally means he did malika in silence, which for our purposes actually means that he just didn't have any specific intent. So malak b'shtika, umitza hadam chutz lizmano. And ultimately, again, he had in mind to do the blood application outside of the right time. O shemalak chutz lizmano, or for that matter, again, you had in mind to do malika, right, with an intention outside of the time, umitza dam b'shtika, and then you did mitzui without any kavana, o shemalak umitza hadam chutz lizmano, or you did both malika and mitzah with an intention for chutz lizmano. So we'll say all of these are examples. Zeu shekarav hamatir kimitzvaso. This is an example, ultimately, again, where the permitter was offered correctly and the carbon would become pigel. Why, Rabbi? See what's happening over here? Because in all of these cases, halacha l'maisa, there is an intent, ultimately, again, for chutz lizmano, and no contravening or contradicting intent to undermine that. This is as we've seen before, therefore the carbon becomes pigel. Keitzad lo karav hamatir kimitzvah. So, Rabbi say, what's an example of where the matir was not offered up in the right way? For example, malak chutz limkomo. When the kohen did malika, he had in mind to do it outside of the permitted area. Mitzah hadam chutz lizmano, and then he went ahead and he did mitzui outside of the permitted time. O shemalak chutz lizmano, or he did malika ultimately. Oh, sorry, or he did malika ultimately again outside of the permitted time. Umitza adam chutz limkomo, and he did have kavanah for mitzvah outside of the permitted time. Oh, shemalak umitza adam chutz limkomo, or he had in mind ultimately again to do malika and mitzvah outside of the permitted area. So we'll say so again. So or top of Samechei 65a. Chata sa'of shemalku shelo lishma umitza adam chutz lizmano. Or for example, like chata sa'of, he did malika ultimately again shelo lishma, and he had in mind for the mitzui, right, for the blood application, chutz lizmano, o shemalak chutz lizmano umitza damo shelo lishma, or he did malika outside of the kavana outside, thank you, outside of the permitted time, and mitzui shelo lishma, o shemalak umitza hadam shelo lishma, or he did malika and mitzah shelo lishma. All of these are examples. Zeu shalakarav hamatir kimitzasa. So remember again, a little bit of chazara by pigel. Remember, in order for a carbon to become pigel, two things have to happen. Number one, the matir, the permitter, has to be offered, and what else? There can't be any other intent, negative intent, other than pigel. So remember again, if you mix in any other invalidating intent with a machshava of pigel, then what happens? The carbon is pasul, but doesn't become pigel. Carbon only becomes pigel if pigel is the only disqualifying intent that you have. If you mix in anything else in there, a chutz limkomo, a shelo lishma, ultimately the carbon will be pasul, but not pigel, and therefore no chiyuv kares. Incredible. Good. So the Gemara says, good. So some other examples. Lechol kizayis b'chutz, kizayis lamachar. So let's say, we'll say again, you have in mind to eat one kizayis, the carbon, b'chutz, outside of the permitted time, and one kizayis lamachar, outside of the permitted place, and one kizayis lamachar tomorrow outside of the permitted time, or kizayis b'chutz, or kizayis lamachar, kizayis l'chutz, or kichatzi zayis b'chutz, kichatzi zayis lamachar, or ultimately again a half a kizayis outside of the permitted area, and a half a kizayis outside of the permitted time, kichatzi zayis lamachar, or half a kizayis tomorrow outside of the permitted time, kichatzi zayis b'chutz. In all of these cases, pasul ve'ein bo kares. We'll say same thing. In order for a carbon to become pigel, number one, first of all, you have to have in mind about a kizayis, right? Because halacha l'maisa, half a kizayisim don't combine. Someone has to be a kizayis. And number two, halacha l'maisa could only be one disqualifying intent. The moment you mix in something else into the machshavas, into the thoughts over here, the carbon can still be pasul, but it cannot be pigel. Incredible. Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: Zaklal, this is the rule. In machshavas hazman, kadma lemachshavas hamakom. So we'll say ultimately again, if your machshava about chutz lizmano comes before machshavas hamakom, ultimately again a machshava of eating it. In other words, if you have a machshava to eat the carbon or to do some type of the avodah outside of the permitted time, and that machshava precedes the machshava to go ahead and consume the carbon and do part of the avodah outside of the permitted place, pigel, the carbon ultimately is pigel, the chayavin alav kares, and ultimately again you will be chayiv kares. Again, I will say, so Rabbi Yehuda's logic is, Rabbi Yehuda says, even if you have another machshava's psul, or right, an erroneous mindset, as long as your machshava for chutz lizmano is first, that can make the carbon pig. We saw this before already. The machshavas hamakom kadma lemachshavas hazman pasal ve'in bo kares. But ultimately, again, if your machshava for going out and consuming or burning part of the carbon outside of the permitted place comes before eating it or doing some type of the avodah outside of the permitted time, the carbon is pasul, but ultimately, again, there is no kares. The Chacham say, Zev pasul ve'im kares. The Chacham say like Tanakama. Again, we'll see what the distinction between the two shitas is. That Allah it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which kavanah came first. The moment you have some other erroneous mindset mixed into the sacrificial service is the moment ultimately, again, that the carbon can no longer become pigul. It can only become a pasul, and it is invalidated. You know, both say that statement of Rabbi Yehuda, so interesting because sometimes just you see different phrases in different ways at different times. And it struck me yesterday a little bit that phrase. Go back to that for just a moment. I'm Rabbi Yehuda, Zaklal. In machshavas hazman, kadma lemachshavas hamakom, pigul v'chayav and alav kares. Right? According to Rabbi Yehuda says like this, just like literally halachically, Rabbi Yehuda says, if your machshava of chutz lizmano, of going ahead and eating the carbon or doing some part of the avodah, outside of the permitted time, comes before machshavas hamakom, outside of the permitted area, machshava for outside of the permitted area. Rabbi Yehuda says it's still pigul, right? So halachically, Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, even if you have mixed in there another disqualifying mindset, as long as the machshava for pigul comes first, ultimately, again, the carbon is going to be pigul. So I was thinking about a lot like in life. So there are kind of like two things that occupy our mind a lot, right? Two things that hopefully we constantly think about. Number one is a machshavas hazman, right? Machshavas hazman ultimately is contemplation of our future. Like who do I want to be in life? Where do I want to go? What do I want to accomplish? Life goes by so quickly. And by the time we wake up and we realize that we'd like to do something with our lives, ultimately, again, we're so much of it is behind us. It's like I mentioned this a little while ago. The Piazetzner writes in his opening for Tzav V'Zerus, right, which is his diary. Essentially, the Piazetzner says that by the time we know what we want to do in life, life is over. Right? The Piazetzner says, if only HaKadosh Baruch Hu would give us two lifetimes. In the first lifetime, I would figure out what I want to do when I grow up. And then in the second lifetime, I would actually do it. But ultimately, says the Piazetzner, it doesn't work that way. And by the time I figure out what I want to do in life, the Piazetzner says so much of life is already in the rear view mirror. So there's this machshavas hazman. Zman represents ultimately, again, what do I want to do with my future? What do I want to do with my life? But there's also machshavas hamakom. Machshavas hamakom means a focus and the maximization of where I am right now. Because in life, there's this tension. On one hand, you could be fully focused on the future to the exclusion of the present. Right? And so a person can say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. All this time spent on planning a future while fundamentally missing out on the maximization of the present. So there's machshavas hazman, which is the machshava about what your future is going to be, and machshavas hamakom. But where I am right now, here's where I am. I'm literally here right now. And what am I doing to maximize my present? And Rabbi Yehuda says something amazing. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you live a life where machshavas hazman is always kadma lemachshavas hamakom, if you're living a life where all you're doing is always focusing on the future and what's gonna be, and you fail to focus on the maximization of the present, Rabbi Yehuda says, pigul v'chayav and alav kares. That's perhaps the greatest sin of all. It's important to plan for your future. But there's something interesting about planning for your future, which is, right? No matter how much you plan, it is going to be dramatically different than anything you imagine for yourself. Hopefully better, but certainly different. So people who spend their entire lives planning for their future, but don't focus on the maximization of their present, Rabbi Yehuda says, that's the greatest sin of all. Because at the end of the day, the only thing you really control in life is right now. is this moment. What you do with this moment in front of you right now, that is the only thing in life you absolutely unequivocally control. You control your makam. You control your present moment. And failure to maximize that because you're planning some type of unknown future, Rabbi Yehuda says, perhaps the greatest avera a person could commit. Pigel v'yesh bo kares. You have to plan for your future, but at the end of the day, more important than planning for your future, or just as important as planning for your future, is maximization of the present moment. Incredible. Lechol kichatzi zayis, ulahakti kichatzi, finish up the Mishnah. To eat a half a kizayis, and ultimately again to burn half a kizayis, kosher, shavazai. So that's like that. That's talking about over here. Let's see two different machshavas, right? The machshava to eat half a kizayis now and half a kizayis tomorrow, right? So for or chutz limkomo chutz lizmano. Ultimately, again, the Mishnah says that's kosher. That doesn't impact the carbon. Why? Shinachila b'aktorah b'tzdarfin. Ultimately, again, so this is let's say a person has in mind to eat half a kizayis tomorrow and to burn half a kizayis tomorrow. So on one hand, both machshavas ultimately are for what? Are for chutz lizmano. But because they're each on half a kizayis ultimately doesn't combine to create a pigel prohibition. Incredible. I will say that was a Mishnah, right? That is a lot of information in that Mishnah. So the Gemara says as follows. Tanabanan. We'll say, here we go. Tanabanan. Vihikrivo. So we'll say the pasuk over here. Now, we'll say what I want to point out is just a little bit of the confusing part. Right? A little bit of the confusing part is all the confusing part. But a little bit of the confusing part, just stylistically, is that although the Mishnah began with a conversation about Olas Ha'of, remember, this Mishnah goes back and forth between Ola and Chatas. So I'll just point out, by the way, you'll notice if you look in the Mishnayos in Zevachim, this Mishnah over here is about 3 or 4 different Mishnayos. So again, it's always interesting to see like how Mishnayos are broken up in Mishnayos, but somehow in Gemara, often multiple Mishnayos become one comprehensive Mishnah. But in any event, so when you see that as separate Mishnayos, they're a lot more topical. But here it's one chalent of Mishnah, beautiful chalent of Mishnah. So the Gemara says, They both say this pasuk where the Gemara is quoting is by Olas Ha'of. So the pasuk is V'hikrivo akoin ela mizbeach. I'm just reading to you the pasuk. The kohen will bring the Olas Ha'of to the mizbeach. Umalak es rosho. Literally, he'll do malika to its head. V'hektir ha-mizbecha. He'll burn it on the mizbeach. V'nimsa damo al ker mizbeach, and he will go and apply the blood, mitzui, apply the blood on the wall of the mizbeach. So we'll say, so remember again, this is Olas Ha'of. Olas Ha'of, the Mishnah is telling us, remember again, kohen comes up the ramp, hangs a right, comes to the southeast corner, goes on the sovev, does malika on the sovev. So here we go. This is incredible. So we'll say, what does the pasuk teaching me? Since the Torah tells us that when you bring an Olas Ha'of, you could bring from Torah or Bnei Yonah, which means, again, pigeons or turtle doves. You might have thought like this. Interestingly enough, it phrases it in the plural. You might have thought that therefore whenever you bring an Olas Ha'of, it's a minimum, it's a two-bird minimum for Olas Ha'of, since it's phrased in the plural. Therefore the pasuk phrases it in the singular. No, you shall sacrifice it, which tells us that even a singular bird could be offered up as a carbon. Yavi ala mizbeach, it shall be brought to the mizbeach. Ma ha-kohen. So we'll say, why does the pasuk have to say the kohen? Now we'll say, now, once it says it's being done by the mizbeach, then what? Who else is doing it? Obviously, it's going to be the kohen. So you must listen to this. So matam lomer ha-kohen. Like, well, kohen, to tell us kohen has to do it. So you must say, okay, shiyachol. I would have thought it's false. V'alo dinu uma ben son shekavalot safon no kavalot kohen. They both say an animal sacrifice. Remember again, they both say animal karbanos. Where they offered safon in the north, right? They both say, remember again, north. Yet, halacha l'maisa, again, even though there is a tzafon requirement, it does not require a kohen. Why doesn't it require a kohen? Shchitas kshera bizar. Even a non-kohen could go ahead and do the avodah. Of shalo kavalat tzafon, so a bird which does not have a northern requirement, in odin shlo yipol kohen, perhaps should not require a kohen either. Talmud lomar ela kohen likbol kohen. Therefore, the Torah says no, it has to be done by a kohen. So also, it's very interesting. As much as we say shchita kshera bizar, it's only the shchita of a regular animal carbon that is kosher by a non-kohen. But halacha l'maisa, bird offering must be done by the kohen, which I will say is actually not a chiddush anyway, because the truth is a Yisrael couldn't really enter into this area where the carbon is being shechted anyway. But okay, has to be done by a coin. I might have thought maybe Malika is done with a knife. So the Gemara says, the dinu, so shchita, which doesn't require a coin, yet does require a utensil, a knife. Malika shakavala coin and then shake below kli. So Malika, which does require a coin, should certainly require a knife. Tamulamar koin malak. Therefore, the pasuk says yes, it requires a coin, but doesn't require a knife. Requires is Malika done by hand. I'm Rabbi Akiva. The chisala adaitcha shezar karev the gabim is back. The Gemara jumps back for a second. I don't understand. What's the havamina that a non-coin would be shechting the bird, right? What's the havamina for that? After all, again, the bird offering has to be done by the mizbeach. How could a non-Kohen come to the Mizbeach? Ella matamalamar Kohen. So therefore, Rabbi Kiva says differently. Why does the Torah say Kohen? Listen to this. Shetehei malika ba'atzmo shal Kohen. That the malika itself must be done by the Kohen himself, which means what Rabbi say? What does it mean? By the Kohen's body and not by a knife. It's interesting that Rabbi Akiva understands that malika is done by hand and not by knife through the word haKohen. Fascinating. So I might have thought that Malika could be done. That was here says Malika, but really what it means is the blood application. I might have thought that the blood application could be done. Now again, remember again, above the Chota Sikra, below the Chota Sikra. Remember again, the red line that bisects the Mizbeach. I might have thought it doesn't matter where you do the blood application. You could do it wherever you want. Tamalomar. Umalak vehiktir. Therefore, the pasuk says you do Malika and Haktar, the burning. Mahaktar b'rosh Mizbeach, just like burning of the bird carcass is done on the top of the mizbeach. Af malika b'rosh mizbeach. So to the blood application is done on top. Now, remember that's not literal because remember burning is done actually on top. When it says on the top of the mizbeach for the blood application, what does it mean? On the upper part of the mizbeach, above the red line, above the chut hasikra. So the Gemara says, umalak mimor umalak. You do malika mimul oref. It's done from the back of the neck of the bird. You're saying from the back of the neck, but maybe not. Maybe it's from the front. Maybe it's from the actual front of the neck. It says over here they'll do malika, and it says over there they'll do malika. So the Gemara says, just like over there, it's ultimately from the back of the neck. At first wide line, afkan mimul oref. So over here is from the back of the neck. Ima lahalan molek venu mavdil. But 1 second. Now, both say the Gemara's bringing it from chatas off. By chatas, you do malika only on one simid, right? Only the esophagus or the windpipe, and the rest remains attached. Afkan. So maybe by olas off, we say the same thing. Afkan molek venu mavdil. Tamulomar. Umalak vehiktir. Therefore, the pasuk says you shall do malika and burn it. Mahak Torah, just like by chatas, by olas off. Excuse me. Just like ultimately, again, you burn the head and the body separately by olas ha'of. So too, when it comes to olas ha'of, the malika totally severs the head. Incredible. How do you know that by olas ha'of, the body and the head are burned separately? When it says you shall burn it, that's referring to the burning of the body of the olas. We'll say we're on 65a, fourth wide line in. So when it says you shall burn it on the mizbeach, what is that referring to? That is referring ultimately again to the burning of the head. So you see over here that the head and the body are burned separately. And I will say now, the truth is, we saw that in the Mishnah, right? That the head is burned earlier on, and the body itself is only burned later. V'nimtza damo. So ultimately, again, you shall apply the blood, right, of the bird onto the wall of the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, "V'lo al kir hakevesh, v'lo al kir hahechal." Ultimately, to tell us that the blood application of the bird is done on the wall of the mizbeach and not on the wall of the ramp, nor on the wall of the heichal. Ve'iza zeh, and which part of the wall of the mizbeach is this done? Zeh kira elyon. Once again, this refers to the part of the wall of the mizbeach above the red line, the chut hasikra. Oh, eina ela kira tachton. Maybe it's below the red line. When it comes to an animal sacrifice, a chatos is done above the chut sikra, and an olah is done below. Oh, shechataso lemata So by an oath, where again we've already established that for a chatas oath, the blood application is below the chota sikra. Surely the ola is going to be lamata b'chota sikra. Tamulomar umalak vehikter v'nimsa damo. The Gemara says v'chisala adaitcha la'achar shehikter chozer umas. And interestingly enough, the order of the pasuk is very strange, right? Because the pasuk itself says you'll do malika, you'll burn the offering, and then you'll do the blood application. Now, obviously, it doesn't make any sense. How can you do the blood application after the bird is already burnt? So the Gemara says, could it be possible that you're going to burn the offering and then go back and apply the blood? Rather, it's to teach us that what? Mahaktara barosh hamizbeach, af mitzvah barosh hamizbeach. Just like haktara, just like the burning is done on the top of the mizbeach, so too the blood application is done on the top of the mizbeach. And as we said before, remember again, burning is quite literally done on the top of the mizbeach. When we talk about blood applications being done on top, what is that referring to? Ultimately, again, that's referring to the area above the red line. Ha ketzad. So we'll say, how was it done? Ha ketzad. Ola bekevesh. So we'll say, so here it is. You go up the rep. This is talking again now by Ola Sa'of. You come up the rep, hang a right, go onto the sovev, go onto the ledge, come to the southeast corner. Then ultimately, again, the Kohen holding the burden in his hand. And also yesterday we demonstrated, right? We saw the pictures, how Malika was done. Machlokes tells us everybody else, one hand, two hands, right? You do Malika from the back of the neck, umavdil. Now again, this is talking about Ola Sa'of. You sever both the windpipe and the esophagus, sever the head from the body, and you do the blood application on the wall of the mizbeach. Now, both say, now, just understand something. So remember, because all of this is happening on the sovev, the chut hasikra, the red line, is below the sovev. Right? So by definition, the Kohen is already standing on the ledge, which is above the red line. He's applying the blood on the wall of the mizbeach over here above the red line. Okay, so the Gemara says, so it says, therefore, again, just to understand, so the Kohen is quite literally, again, standing on the sovev, standing on the ledge, and applying the blood on the wall of the mizbeach right in front of him, which is above the red line. Now, interestingly, the Gemara said, now, interestingly enough, the red line was actually 1 amma below the sovev, and therefore the Gemara says over here, even if the Kohen did the blood application, he reached down, and he did the blood application below him, it would still be kosher, right? Why? Because even 1 amma, up to 1 amma below him was still above the red line. Very interesting. No. So we'll say, interestingly enough, and the Rabbi Yaakov say that the entire avoda was done ultimately again berosh hamizbeach. Rashi says berosh hamizbeach tebainan vehekter v'nimsa damo she'sovev bekira hasamoch l'makom aktara. So both say, so interesting. Rabbi Yaakov disagree. Right, according to Tanakama, right. So remember again, the blood application of the bird offering has to be done above the chut hasikra. But Tanakama holds that even if the Kohen dabbed it on the mizbeach below the sovev, as long as it's within 1 amma below the sovev, you're good, because the chut hasikra was 1 amma below the sovev. So as long as it's applied below the sovev, you're fine. Rabbi Nechemia, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov disagree, and they say no. It has to be, the blood application has to be done on the wall of the mizbeach above the sovev. What's their fundamental difference? My b'nai, what's the fundamental difference? Rabbi Abaye, Rabbi Abaye, this is very interesting. The nafkamina will say the machlokes is, can you make a fire on the sovev? Now again, I will say the halacha is like this, because the Torah itself juxtaposes mitzvah tak Torah, blood application, to burning. We learn from that just geographically, the blood application and the burning have to be done in the same space or close to each other. So therefore, the shaila is, can you go ahead and actually kindle a fire on the sovev? Now, not a good idea, right? Not a good idea, but can you do it? Tanakama says yes. Therefore, he holds that you can even do the blood application within the amma below the sovev, because ultimately the blood application and the burning will still be juxtaposed or close to each other. Rabbi Nechemia, Rabbi Elazar is saying, no, you can't make a fire on the sovev. A fire is only made on the top of the mizbeach. Therefore, in order for the blood application to be next to the fire itself, the blood application has to be on the wall of the mizbeach above the sovev and not below. Fascinating. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows: Balo leguf tanabanan v'hesres marasa. So we'll say now we're continuing again in the avoda of the bird carbon. Tanabanan v'hesres marasa benotsasa zu zefek. So also when the pasuk says you shall remove the crop with its feathers, so this refers zefek is another word for crop. You might have thought that maybe like you go and you make a cut in the bird with a knife and remove the crop like that. Therefore, the pasuk says with his feathers. You take the feathers together with it. Abi Yossi ben Chanan Omer. Notla v'notel kurkibana imo. You also take out the gizzard along with the other parts of the bird. So the Gemara says, the Rabbi Shmuel Tana ben Otsasa benotza shalo kodra b'sakin kimin aruba. So this is very interesting. Tana ben Shmuel says, what we do is we make a little bit of an incision in the bird, almost like a window-like opening, so as to allow us to go ahead and go in and grab out these parts of the bird, grabbing the crop that comes out together with the gizzard, that then brings out the intestines, and the feathers, surrounding feathers, come out with it as well. Amud Beis, Shisa v'lo hivdil. So it says, remember again, by Ola Sa'of, what do? You tear the bird in half. You tear the bird in half, but you do not totally separate the two parts. Tan Rabbanan. V'shisa and v'shisa elabiyad. When the Kohen tears the bird into two, this is ultimately being done by hand. So the Gemara says, "V'cheinu omer v'yishaseu kishes hagdi." So I'll say, interesting enough, what's the raya for this? The raya for this ultimately again is from Shimshon, right? That when Shimshon tore apart the animal, ultimately again he tore it apart by hand. Same notion of v'yishaseu. So v'shisa means tearing something apart by hand. So to the Kohen almost tears the bird into two, again, not separating the two pieces by hand. Incredible. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah then went on to say as follows: as much as we outline all of the different parts of the avoda of chatas of and ola sa'of, like an animal carbon, as long as you did zrika, right? As long as by a bird, it's mitzah. As long as you did the blood application, ultimately, again, you're good to go. And if you omitted any of the other subsequent parts, halacha l'maisa, the carbon is still effective. So the Gemara says, Masisin de lo Rabbi Elazar Shimon, Disanya, Rabbi Shimon, Shamati Shemavdilin bechata sa'of. So Rabbi Elazar Shimon says, I heard ultimately, again, Shemavdilin. I will say now, in this context, Mavdilin ultimately means separating the head from the body. I heard that we do separate the head of the body from chatas off. Now, remember again, in our Mishnah, in yesterday's Mishnah, we saw that by chatas off, you only sever one of the simanim and leave the head connected. By ola sa'of, you're severing both simanim. So now the Gemara says, by the way, there is another opinion. Rabbi Shimon who says, I heard shemavdilin b'chatas sa'of. Rabbi Shimon holds that no, you sever the head even by chatas sa'of. So the Gemara says, what is the practical difference between these two opinions? Amrav Chista mitzui chatas sa'of ma'akev ika beinayu. The fundamental distinction ultimately again between them is mitzui by chatas sa'of ma'akev. In other words, both say the blood, the squeezing out of the blood from the chatas sa'of is that ma'akev. Is that process ma'akev? If you take a look, actually, let's see. The Gemara says, Tanakama Savar, mitzvah chatas sa'of ma'akev. The squeezing out of the blood by chatas sa'of is absolutely ma'akev. V'chevan de mitzvah dam ma'akev, ma'isa ola b'chatas sa'of. And since ultimately, again, mitzvah dam is going to be ma'akev, so therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if you end up severing the head, that becomes an act ultimately again of ola sa'of by a chatas, and therefore again it would be possible. Rabbi Shimon holds mitzvah chatas of lo ma'akev. He holds that ultimately again mitzvah chatas of is not ma'akev, and therefore halacha l'maisa mechatech basar ba'almahu. It's considered to be that taking off of the head, that additional amount taking off the head, is just considered to be cutting away the flesh of the bird, and therefore again does not render the carbon possible. Rava says no. The machlokes is something else. It's very interesting. Shehiyah b'simin shini ba'ola sa'of ma'akev ika benayu. Shabbos say very quickly that by shchita, in general by hilchos shchita, one of the interesting things that can invalidate shchita is what we call shehiyah. Shehiyah literally means waiting or delaying. In other words, let's say you're shechting an animal for dinner. The halach is you have to cut both. Someone you have to cut them quickly. Right? Why? Because let's say you cut the esophagus and then you wait to go ahead and cut the windpipe. What's the concern? the animal rides. Because it rides, the second siman may tear, but not as a result of cutting, as a result of the animal's movement. That actually renders an animal a treifa. So therefore, shchita, one of the most important pieces is quickness, quickheit, right? Quickheit, right? Yeah, right? It has to be, right? Immediacy, alacrity, right? Zrizos, right? You have to do it very quickly. So interestingly, maybe the machlokes over here is shehiyah b'simin sheni ba'olah ha'saof. What happens by olah ha'saof if you delay in cutting the second simin? So the Gemara says, Tanakama savar shehiyah b'simin sheni ba'olah ha'saof lo ma'akev. He holds that shehiyah is not a big deal, and therefore va'afagav the shehiyah ka'avid ma'isa olah b'chatos, and therefore alocha l'ma'isa. Even if a person was ma'akev, he ended up doing a ma'isa olah by a chatasov, which will make it possible. From those Rabbi Shimon Silber ma'akev, it is ma'akev v'chevin d'shia mechatech basar ba'almahu. Ultimately, again, even though he is mishah, even though he does delay, it's just considered to be halacha l'ma'isa mechatech basar, just cutting away flesh, and ultimately, again, and therefore it's mechatech basar ba'alma, and therefore again does not invalidate. Abaye says, Rov basar ma'akev ikabenai. Abaye says no. So we'll say no. We'll stop over here for today. I'm sorry. Now we went a little bit quickly this last piece. Again, we'll see Abaye's interpretation ultimately again of this machlokes. Close out the sugya and Emir Hashem again. See the Rambam halacha l'maisa tomorrow. Shkayach everyone. Wow, what a daf! What a daf! All right, Chevra Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. A lot of information. I know.
And we're going to take a trip to the slaughterhouse.
You're not going to see birds. They do birds? No, they don't do birds at all. Found. Yeah. I mean, no, but a bird. Does anyone chef doves? Well, chefs, right?